We lived in Madison, Wisconsin. I was just going into my sophomore year in high school. The Mexican War was brewing at that time, and I thought I wanted to go into the Mexican War. We did have a home guard outfit in Madison, and we had uniforms, and we drilled once a week. I wanted to, when the troops left for Mexico, or down to the border, that's as far as the National Guard got. See, they only used the regular army in Mexico, going out of the country. My mother objected very strongly because I was only about 15 and a half years old. And she couldn't afford to lose a breadwinner, because we had about 4 or 5 others to eat. Well, anyway, I couldn't go. Finally, I decided that I was going to go. Of course, this was sometime later. Two of my friends, older fellows than I was, that were working, were going to enlist. So I decided that I would go. Well, I went home because it was noontime, and I went home to get something to eat. And while I was eating, my mother says, "What seems to be wrong with you? You're not acting right." Well, I says, "Sooner or later you're going to find out." I says, "Well, I just enlisted, and I'm supposed to go down to the railway station, and I'm going to be with others, and we're going to Chicago, where they're going to do something with us." And I left. And while I was at the depot waiting for the train, my father showed up, see? And I guess my mother was a little too excited to come down. Well, anyway, I left then. And then from there, in a short time, we headed for the East Coast. And we got down to Camp Merritt, and then I got a boat ride on the largest ship afloat, the Leviathan, the Fatherland, they called it. We changed it to the Leviathan. And I made the trip over there to England. And we landed at Liverpool. But finally, I don't know, it was because I was previous service, I was detailed to go to France. And I was sent to a town in France to go to signal school. And that's where I went. I forget whether I spent about 3 months or so. But had I not gone to signal school and gone, to the 1st Division, I would have been in all that first stuff, see? Mm-hmm. I would have made Cantini. When we were at Cantini, when they were at Soissons, I was in, see, like during May, June, mm-hmm. and finally in July, we finished our course. And then I was sent to the 18th Infantry. In those days, when we were studying to be signalmen, the important thing really was wireless. So we had 2 wireless. We had wireless through the air, the old Marconi, and we had the French system, telegraphy sans fil, underground. Well, we had to cut out wireless. And still, too many guys were getting knocked off. for the simple reason that the Germans could pick that up with their equipment, underground or through the air.
Mm-hmm.
So after we lost a sufficient number of men, somebody decided that they would use telephones. So that's where the telephone came in, because they couldn't detect the telephone. Oh, well, that came on the attack, you know. Oh, well, before the night before, incidentally, the night before we went over was my 19th birthday, October the 3rd, and they asked, and we got word that they were bringing up food, they were sending up a field kitchen, and they asked for volunteers to go back and bring this. They couldn't come up, you know, where we were, see, but they were back quite a ways. So I volunteered, because I made that route, you know, up and back. The artillery was stationed back there, and most of the stuff was either between the different outfits or, when necessary, the artillery. Well, anyway, I had gone back, and this kitchen, oh, they were loaded with pork and beans, pork and sow belly, not the sow belly and beans, rather. And I don't know whether they had like a ketchup in them, you know, had them doped up. Well, anyway, there were 3 of us, if I remember correctly. Well, 2 of the guys got beans, but while we were there, and I hadn't eaten for 5 days, and we hadn't had water for longer than that, and I'm telling you, it was played out, and I didn't get any chance to get any sleep. I don't know how I stayed awake. We got back to our place. When we got there, there was the rest of the headquarters company. They had moved in then. And, well, we carried that stuff in there. But before I left that kitchen, I filled up my mess kit with these beans and sow belly, figuring there may be a time when I might consider this a delicacy, which I put in there. Well, we got back there, and I met some of my friends, and one of the fellows had already dug a hole, and I don't know, they must have brought up some of that sheet metal, and he had a cover there. And when I got back and he saw me, he says he had room, you know, for me to sleep with him there. So I did. Went in there, and that was the first sleep that I had, I don't know how many days. Well, you wouldn't believe it. I didn't believe it. Nobody will believe me. But shelling started. And I don't know whether I came to, and all my troops were gone. I went, what the hell, where? My buddy? So I said, boy, I better get moving. So then I started out, and I figured, well, they wouldn't be going back, they'd be going forward. So I started out. And I started walking, and boy, they were really laying them down, and the big ones. And some of them would burst, you know, hole. And as I went along, one of the big ones came and really blew a hole, and I in the hole. And I don't know how long I lay there. Finally, I must have come to, and I pulled myself out of this hole, out of this shell hole, and as I see over the shell hole, I see troops marching, going the same way I would have gone. And sure enough, I asked who they were. They were the 26th Infantry, you know, part of the 1st Division. And the captain, and he had guy with him, and I couldn't figure what happened. I told him, I don't know, and I guess it had been raining, and I got up, and I guess I was pretty muddy. And so we talked, and I said, well, I better, where is the 18th Infantry? I says, if I don't get back there, I says, I'm going to get in trouble. And he said, yeah, well, I have no idea where they are, but if they're up there somewheres. He says, you probably can't make it there. Well, I says, well, I'm a signalman. I says, Christ, I'm supposed to be an important guy there. And I says, I've been up here in advance taking care of the signal work. He says, you're what? I says, I'm a signalman. He says, what part of it? I says, I'm a telephone man, lineman. You're a lineman? He says, you're not going anywhere. He says, you're falling in with us. He said, we lost our signalman and we'll be needing help. Well, I said, boy, if I get in trouble, he says, I'll take care of that. And I said, will you give me a note or something when we're through here? And he says, yes. And I stayed with him till they carried me off the battlefield. Yes, it was pretty hot. And as I say, the shells were falling in the midst of our men, our own shells. And we had no communication there at where I was at there. And there were corpsmen that had come up, and it was a doctor. And all of a sudden, they started bringing the men where the Germans had been shelling. They dug out like on the side of a hill, and a place that you could go and take cover. And they were bringing some of those people over there that were wounded. And they brought one man over who had been hit in the neck, and it made a hole in his jugular vein. And they brought him over there and set him down on the ground and propped him up. I couldn't do anything for him, and I saw the medics out there, and I rushed out there, and the doctor, I says, I got a man here very serious. I says, he's bleeding very bad. I said, there's an opening in his throat. So he came over with me, and when he got over, he looked. He says, there's nothing that we could do for him. He says, it'll only be a moment or so. All his blood will be gone, and that'll be it. Well, I stayed there with that man, and he finally took his last breath. And I've never forgotten that. That has been a thing that has lost a lot of sleep for me. Still does after all these years. Well, anyway, after he expired, I went into this opening spot. And as I'm going into this opening spot, there's a shell burst. Of course, naturally I heard it, and whether I ducked or not, I don't know, but I must have done something. And all of a sudden I felt a thump on my back, pretty good thump. And I figured it was a piece of shrapnel. And lo and behold, some of the men there, and aides come running over to me, grabbed me, figuring that I was bleeding. Well, when they found out and when I knew what it was the first laugh we had had in a long, long time. Inside of that pack, I still had that untouched, prior to the thump, of the baked beans and that so-called pork and beans with the ketchup in it. It hit me so hard that it went through on the pack, through this heavy aluminum mess kit. And then, of course, the beans in there. I got a good thump. I had a bruise, but didn't cut. But I had blood coming. The juice from the baked beans were running down my back. And as I say, everybody thought I had gotten a bad wound and were going to do something. But when I told them what I had there, boy, I thought they were going to retire. And to me, it got funny. It got funny. It could have been pretty darn serious, but I had something that would kind of cheer them up. I don't know how long I was with the 26th. That was Teddy Roosevelt Jr.'s. He was colonel of the regiment. And I don't know how far I went, whether I passed out or I was that bad, you know, with shell shock or the gas. And anyway, I'm laying on the ground there, and it was kind of chilly. It was October. It was October the 12th. One place they said 11th, and I figured maybe they meant the night of the 11th, because when I came to, it was dark, and I heard somebody talking. And I spoke up, tried to speak. My throat was awful bad, and I couldn't see. And I asked, is there somebody over there near me? And the guy answered, yes. I said, what am I doing here? Well, he says, you're waiting to be evacuated to a hospital. I said, how did I get here? I said, I don't remember anything getting here. He said, they brought you in on the back of a signal car mule. They'd have two rolls, one on each side, you know, over their back like a saddle. And he said, you came in over the back between those rolls. They had you on there. Then they brought you over and laid you on the ground. Oh, I said, they laid me, and I said, they must have dropped me on the ground, because I said, that's when I must have come to. So I lay there until they came with a stretcher. And then the ambulance pulled in, this one I'm talking about, horse-drawn, and I was put in there, and then I was taken to an evacuation hospital. So they took some of us that were recuperating. This was within a month, and put us out in tents. Well, they put us out in tents, and then we got word that we were going to be sent to a replacement camp and sent to some outfit. Well, geez, I didn't want that. And I squawked about it. Well, they can't send me back to my own outfit. The order is that you go to a replacement camp and they send you where they need you. Well, that morning, I went for some breakfast, and then I had a thing there that blew me off. I had gotten hold of a .45, brand new. Some guys had got into a boxcar where they had ammunition and guns and stuff, and they got a crate of .45s. And I got one from one of the fellas. At the hospital, I met a fellow from Madison, Wisconsin. And his father was a big shot politician. And incidentally, I used to go out with his sister, which made it all worse. And I went to eat, and so did he. When I come back, I decided I'm going to go EWL. Well, I left. I started out and I started to walk. This was the early morning of November the 11th. which incidentally turned out to be Armistice Day. Well, I'm trying to get away, from the place, and I'm walking down a lonely road, and I saw what looked like a little store, and I thought, maybe I can bump. I didn't have any money, so I thought I'd go by to this store. Well, I got by there and it was closed. Well, I turned around to walk, and I hear horns blowing. And I thought, they're coming after me to get me, either do something with me or get me to go to that camp, And as I just kept walking, and all of a sudden something pulls up close to me, and I turn around, and it's a Jeep with 4 French soldiers in there. And they're shouting to me, "Finis la guerre, finis la guerre." Well, I knew some French by then, and I thanked them. Didn't mean anything to me. I was hungry. I didn't have any money. Well, besides, the store wasn't open. So I just made the best of it, and I started to walk again. I walked, I don't know how many days. Finally, trucks were coming back towards my way. And I finally got somebody to stop. And I asked, by any chance, where were you? And they looked at me. Well, I says, I'm trying to find my outfit. I says, I'm with the 1st Infantry Division. And I said, I just got out of the hospital. And I said, I'm on my way to find them. He said, we just came back. He said, we left them up in the Luxembourg City, Luxembourg. But they weren't going to be there. They were supposed to pull out the next day. Well, then I got a break. There were other transports going up. And some might go 3-4 miles. I'd get a ride for 3-4 miles. Then he'd pull in, somewhere on the way where there were troops. Then another one come along. And I'd be hiking in the meantime. I finally got to Luxembourg City, but they naturally weren't there. So then I had to get to a place called Gravenmacher, Luxembourg, which was right on the Moselle River. And I knew then that I had to catch up with them because the armistice, a lot of people called it, the war was over. Well, it wasn't over. And we couldn't go into Germany then. We had a truce. That was an armistice. And we were supposed to stay on the one side of the Moselle River until December the 1st.
Max, I think we'll finish up by asking you to remember just a little bit about the formation of the Society of the 1st Division there in Germany, and perhaps a little bit about the circus, and then we can go on from there.
Well, I was in the hospital when they started it. Well, I don't know whether most of the people don't know that the 1st Division Society originally was for officers. Then, of course, some of the first sergeants or
Master sergeants?
Well, we called them the company clerks,
Mm-hmm.
the guys that had the special braid on their hat,
Mm-hmm.
They were like officers going to a training school, Well, some of them were in there. Maybe the doctors or something. Well, then it was opened up. As we were in Germany, they decided to have a reunion. The men we still were not in the society, in reality, see. They had a banquet. Those days, banquets cost money, the same as they do now. And there were very few, from my knowledge, of the enlisted men, unless they got money from home, was able to afford to buy a ticket to the reunion. That is, to the dinner. So I did not attend. I knew that the reunion was on. I was part of the reunion, but I did not go to the banquet until after we came home. Then they organized branches, and we had a branch in Chicago. Well, anyway, we organized, and we came out here to Cantini Farm. McCormick, we knew that, McCormick was a colonel. That is, he became a colonel, I think, after he left France.
I think that's right. He was a major when he commanded his
Well,
battalion.
he was a lieutenant colonel.
Mm-hmm.
He was made a lieutenant colonel, as far as I know.
Mm-hmm.
And then at Cantini, he wasn't there very long.
Mm-hmm.
He was supposed to have been ill,
Mm-hmm.
and they claimed that he was directing the 6th Field from his bed, which may be true.
Prepare to get underway. And within 5 minutes, we were on our way out of the harbor, headed for what later was to be known as Normandy. And our duty, our job, was to escort the landing craft that carried the tanks to Green Beach on Utah Beach. That was our assignment. And we were evidently leading from behind because the LCT that was directly ahead of us hit a mine and it blew up. Those that were forward, on the forward part of the deck that saw it, said it looked like that LCT rose up out of the water about 4 feet and then went straight to the bottom, and leaving the water full of dead and dying men. Well, we were right behind them, so the captain cut the engines and we drifted right into the midst of that. I was in the chow room for some reason, the mess hall, and I was headed back forward when I realized that the ship had stopped. And then I looked and saw the bodies in the water. I was not entirely prepared for this, and my knees buckled under me. Now, you've heard of knees buckling. Well, it actually happens. My knees buckled and I would have fallen had it not been for the lifeline that runs around the edge of all the ships. After a few seconds, my training took over, and I got a life ring off the 20 millimeter gun mount, and I saw a soldier, his head was above the water. He was just looking at me. I threw the life ring to him. It hit right in front of him, but he made no effort to grab it. I don't know whether he was in shock, or whether he was paralyzed, or whether in fact he might have been dead with his eyes still open. But his eyes were looking right at me. But he would not grab the life ring, and he slowly sank, went out of sight. But even after he got under the water away, I could still see his eyes looking right at me. I saw no further evidence of life on that side of the ship, so I went to the other side of the ship and saw a soldier who was, his flotation device was working well, but he was hollering for help. And I threw the life ring to him. He grabbed it, and I pulled him to the edge of the ship. I called a shipmate to help me, and we dragged him aboard and got him to a fairly protected place on the deck. Both of his legs were broken and dangling. I went to find the medic. Subchasers do not carry pharmacist mates or medics. So our chief motor machinist was our medic, but all he had was a bag full of little styrettes of morphine, a little tube with a needle and an ounce of morphine in it. He came and cut the trouser legs on the top of each of the thighs of the soldier we had there, put a shot of morphine in each leg, and that's all we could do in the way of medication. While he was doing that, I ran forward to get my blankets off of my bunk to cover the man and try to get him warm. I got to my bunk, my blankets were already gone, so I grabbed the first two that I did see and came back and covered him up. Tried to make him a little bit comfortable as we went to attack transport Dickman. We were ordered to take our survivors. We got 8 soldiers and 1 sailor. We were ordered to take them to the attack transport Dickman to be offloaded and to be tended to. The attack transport had brought their troops to the beach. They went ashore in landing craft, and they were now waiting for the wounded to come back. So we probably brought them their first wounded. After we discharged our wounded, we went back to directing the landing craft. The other sub-chasers in the group had been doing the job for us. There were 7 sub-chasers in the Normandy invasion. We maintained contact by voice radio mainly, but we did have code names. Each of the 7 sub-chasers was named for a fruit: apple, orange, banana, pear, even pomegranate. And the code name for the group as a whole was Fruit Basket. So that's how we communicated among the sub-chasers, using code names. But that's about all we did for the rest of D-Day. At one point, we got in so close to the beach that the propellers were turning up mud, and German 88 that was still active somewhere back in the hills was dropping shells in above us, over and beyond us. We don't know whether they were shooting at us and couldn't get the gun barrel defected enough, or whether they were firing at something further out and falling short. But anyhow, I was glad to get back out of range of that. But D-Day ended later. I believe it was about 12:30 when we anchored at the what was the end of the longest day. But we, of course, were tired, sleepy, but that's the way it was. About 3 days after D-Day, an LST, that's the large landing craft, a mine floated into it midships, probably one of those magnetic mines, and it looked like a knife had hit a slice of butter. It cut it in 2. The stern floated off one way and the rear floated off another way until it sank. And all the equipment that was in that slid into the water. And of course later, at night the Germans would come over and bomb and drop mines, but the only ship I saw sunk by dive bombers was a cargo ship. Evidently it was open at night. Evidently what they were carrying was needed on the beach, so they were unloading at night, and evidently had the hatch open, and a German dive bomber came down and put a bomb right through the hatch, sank it. And I understand that the Meredith, I did not see it, but I understand the destroyer that escorted our column across was sunk at some point. Well, one night we were instructed to go out and pick up a corpse, a body. We found it, which was amazing in the dark. A soldier in full uniform was floating. He'd been in the water some time, of course. We went alongside, and the boatswain mate took a boat hook, hooked it in his belt to bring him to the shore, to the ship where we could pull him aboard. But that was a mistake, because when he pulled on the belt, the body broke in two, and the feet slowly sank one way, and the torso, the head, sank the other way. So we could not recover the corpse. He'd been in the water too long, and he just disintegrated when they put the boat hook on and tried to pull him.
I'm 97 years old, being born during the Great Depression. I was 16 years old when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And I joined the Marines when I was 18, went through World War II, called back to the Korean War. Some type of a legend, because I've been through 7 battles and no Purple Heart. When North Korea invaded South Korea, the reserve battalion was called up in 10 days to report for active duty. So I married my girlfriend, and we had a 10-day honeymoon before I left Dallas on a troop train out of Dallas Naval Air Station. And we formed a division, a 1st Marine Division, within 2 weeks. And within 6 weeks, we were in combat. Not in Russia, not against Russians, but in Korea. We landed at a place called Incheon. Some of the highest tides in the world were at Incheon. And we could get some Marines ashore, but we couldn't give them protection until the tides came in that night. So it was a risk that General MacArthur wanted to take. The president and all of his cabinet were against it, but General MacArthur convinced them that he could do it, that the Marines could do it. So they made wood ladders to climb a seawall, and they went ashore in Higgins boats. And on an island just outside the harbor called Incheon Harbor. And they were expecting a big attack. So we had the battleships there, the cruisers, and all the guns from the Navy to support the Marines. But there was no attack. They didn't have any forces, very many forces up there. But 4 tanks came from Seoul, the capital of South Korea. North Korean tanks. And General MacArthur was up looking at the attack, I think it was, and they were taken out by the new bazookas that had just been manufactured, because the old bazookas, that's an anti-tank missile, were not effective against the Russian T-31s. So they took out the first tank, they took out the fourth tank, and that left the two in the middle. So that was the first battle against the Russian tanks. And they found out that they were very formidable. They were better tanks than our Pattons. And the North Koreans had taken all of Korea, the whole peninsula, except a little toehold at the very tip. And when we landed at Incheon, we broke the supply line, as I said, and changed the tide of the war in 3 days. When we had completed the capture of South Korea, the question came, what do we do? Do we go up into North Korea? And MacArthur wanted to go, so they gave him permission because he was felt so like a hero. Anyhow, they gave us permission to go into North Korea and reunite North and South Korea. So we fought our way up to the border with China and thought that we had reunited North and South, and MacArthur said that the boys would be home for Christmas. So I wrote a letter home, would be home for Christmas. And then on November the 27th, much to our surprise, the Chinese, 200,000, attacked that night about 10 o'clock. We were in artillery, so I was not on the front lines, but they brought in about 400 casualties into our tent area. So that told me that there had been a big battle somewhere. And they had captured a lot of our defense, the Marine defense companies were completely wiped out. And when daylight comes, then you've got air support. And those wonderful pilots would take off from ice-coated decks in snowstorms and to give us air power. When the Chinese attacked, the winter came in, the coldest winter on record into Korea. The Marines all considered that as a divine intervention, because without the cold weather, without air power, we would have been annihilated. The 120,000 Chinese were attacked 18,000 Marines, and the weather was 20 below zero, and everything froze. Our weapons froze, they wouldn't fire. Water froze, plasma froze, morphine, the corpsmen had to hold the morphine in their mouths. And we were trapped. The Mao Tse-tung, the chairman of the Chinese nation, ordered them to destroy the 1st Marine Division to the last man. Well, fortunately, that didn't happen. And with our air power and daylight and our defense at nighttime and the cold weather freezing the Chinese, we managed to fight our way out some 75 miles over an ox cart road to a port where we were evacuated from North Korea to South Korea in what was one of the most epic battles in Marine Corps history. The battle in North Korea took place around a reservoir called Chosun, Janjing in Korean. When the Chinese attacked, we had so many casualties that the 7th Marine Regiment headquarters burned their service records. Chinese actually reached the 7th Marine Battalion headquarters. So many infantrymen had been killed that they called half of our battery up to be infantry. Every Marine is a rifleman. That's the basis of a Marine Corps. You're taught to be a rifleman before anything. So they took the even-numbered gun crews and sent them to the infantry. That left us with 6 guns with only half gun crews, and I was pretty much in charge of that. We had 2 guns firing in one direction, 2 in another direction, and 2 in the third direction because we were surrounded. But a 155 is designed for a long distance, and it was pretty hard to fire short range with them. It was causing damage. But the ones that they sent out were in defense positions on a hill when the Chinese attacked. The Chinese were wearing Marine parkas, so they thought that they were Marines as they approached. They were up on top of them before they knew it. And the cannoneers, artillerymen, found that their weapons, their carbines, wouldn't fire in such cold weather. They had a 30 caliber light machine gun that wouldn't fire. So my friend, Sergeant Jim Johnson, who was in charge of that detail, ordered them all back down and asked them to give him their grenades. And he was last seen in hand-to-hand combat with the Chinese there. I often think about that. If they had asked for the odd-numbered guns, I would have been in where Jim Johnson was. But we had the NCOs, most of us were trained in the past, and the officers that we were coming out with were 90-day wonders or inexperienced leaders, and the NCOs had to take over and virtually to get us out of there. One of the hardest things that I did along in the Korean War was to pick up the frozen bodies of the Marines that had been brought down from the mountainsides to the road where a truck could pick them up. The ground was frozen. We couldn't bury them. We couldn't take them out. So what we did was we used dynamite and bulldozers to try to dig at least a shallow grave that we could bury our Marines in. I helped pick up a lot of those frozen bodies. The arms and legs were in the same position that they had been killed, had been frozen. You couldn't straighten a leg, you couldn't straighten an arm. You just picked them up and threw them in a truck. When we got to Coterie, we buried 117 right behind my howitzer. I say we buried, we scraped snow and dirt and whatever we could do over the Marines there. I have a friend who lives in Dallas. He was a second lieutenant at a place called Hagaroo, which is at the base of the Chosin Reservoir. And he sent out 2 South Koreans dressed as Chinese to mingle with the Chinese and trying to find out where they would hit Hagaroo that night. Because the night before they had all broken through, and when the Chinese broke through, they didn't know what to do. They started looking for food and clothing, and the Marines formed a counterattack and drove them back out. But my friend found out through sending these spies over where they were going to hit that night, or Haggeroo might not have held. And if Haggeroo didn't hold, we were further north. I was with the Marines that went to the furthest north. And if Haggeroo hadn't held, we probably would have been annihilated because we were so far up that we would have had to, it would have been doubtful that we could make it out. The Haggeroo was in danger of falling, being captured and overrun, and our general ordered reinforcements from an outpost further south. The 1st Marine Division was scattered at 5 major points along an ox cart trail for 70 miles up into Korea. And that's where we had to fight our way out to fight another day, really, and evacuated by ships. We took 100,000 civilians out with us. 2 of those refugees from North Korea had a son who became the president later, named Moon of South Korea. And because they're out of 18,000, we took 12,000 casualties, the Marines did. And because there were so few of us left, and because it took place around a battle, or reservoir called Chosen, we became the chosen few. And one of the most respected battles in Marine Corps history. And when you say the chosen few, everybody knows that the frozen chosen. I went from civilian to combat in 6 weeks. I stayed in the Korean Peninsula until May of 1951, when I became a civilian again, when I was discharged. I don't know that I have anything that I could say that I could be proud of except my service, but just being there, everybody says, you're a hero, but I am not a hero. I was there, I did my duty, and I did everything that I was asked to do.
Well, when I got to Vietnam, I literally expected to be welcomed with open arms by the people of Vietnam. I had in my head the black and white newsreels I had seen on the Walter Cronkite 20th Century show of the American troops rolling through villages in France and being showered with wine and flowers and kisses. And as we were driving down, a guy from the battalion I was assigned to picked me up in a Jeep at Da Nang, and we had to drive the 20 miles to where my battalion was located, and I really was disappointed that there weren't people standing along the road waving to me and offering me flowers and things. I really expected to be greeted with open arms as a liberator, and it was as though I was invisible, as though I didn't exist. And that was a little perplexing. Moreover, they looked funny, and they acted funny. I mean, just riding along in this Jeep the first day I got there. They lived in little straw huts, and they had animals in their backyards, and they weren't like us. They smelled bad. The whole country smelled bad. You could smell it. It hurt the nose. And that was disturbing. And then I was there for on the 3rd day I was there, this guy who had picked me up in the Jeep, a corporal who I was ultimately going to replace, he and I were in the battalion intelligence section. We were sent down to the tractor park, the amphibious tractor park, to meet a bunch of detainees. It was our responsibility to take care of prisoners, and detainees were a classification of civilians. They were not combatants. They were They could be detained for questioning, which is why they were called detainees. And Jimmy and I went down there to the track park, and 2 tractors came in. They had a whole bunch of Vietnamese up on top. High, flat-topped vehicles, about 8 or 9 feet tall. And as the tracks wheeled into the park, the Marines up on top immediately began hurling these people off. They were bound hand and foot so that they had no way of breaking their falls. And they were old men, women, children, no young men. And I couldn't believe these guys were treating these people this way. And I turned to Jimmy and said, I grabbed him by the arm and said, what are those guys doing? We're supposed to be helping these people. And Jimmy turned to me and he looked at my hands on his arm. I sort of took them off and he said, Ehrhardt, you better keep your mouth shut until you know what's going on around here. And I think it was at that point that I realized things were not quite what I was expecting. It went downhill from there. And again, I can't even begin to explain in the space of time that you have all of the things that went into it. But I began to understand, it became obvious that the enemy was the very people in these villages around us, and we were in a very heavily populated area at that time. They were the enemy, or at least the enemy was out there somewhere, and we couldn't tell one from another. And day after day, our patrols went out, and we ran into snipers and mines, and snipers and mines, and snipers and mines. I saw 4 armed enemy soldiers the first 8 months I was in Vietnam. And yet our battalion during that same period of time sustained 75 mining and sniping incidents per month, over half of them resulting in casualties. This is for a unit of about 1,000 men. But there was no one to fight back at. And you begin to think, these people are the enemy. They're all the enemy. And then you go through villages and, you get sniped at, and so you call an airstrike in on the village and the whole village goes up. Or you go through a place and you search it and you burn houses and blow them up. The common perception, the notion I had when I was in high school was that the Viet Cong terrorized the Vietnamese population, forced them to fight against the Americans at pain of death. What I began to understand in Vietnam was that they didn't need to do things like that. All they had to do was let a Marine patrol go through a village, and whatever was left of that village, they had all the recruits that they needed. I began to understand why the Vietnamese didn't greet me with open arms, why they in fact hated me. But of course that didn't change the fact that my friends were getting killed and injured every day, and the only place that you could focus your own anger and fear was on those civilians who were there. And so it was this self-perpetuating mechanism. The longer that we stayed in Vietnam, the more Viet Cong there were, because we created them, we produced them. None of that distilled itself into the clear kind of expression that I'm presenting now. What I began to understand within days, and which became patently clear within months, was that what was going on here was not what I had been told. What was going on here was nuts, and I wanted to get out. I knew if I were still alive on March the 5th, 1968, they'd stick me on an airplane in Da Nang. We used to call it the Freedom Bird. And I could fly away and forget the whole thing. Turned out not to be quite so easy to forget it, but that was the notion. And certainly for my last 8-9 months in Vietnam, I ceased to think. I quite literally ceased to think about why I was there or what I was doing. The sole purpose for my being in Vietnam at that point was to stay alive until I could get out. And the reason for that is that, the kinds of questions that begin try to deal with the answers. Now, part of what was going on is that I could not have made sense of what I was seeing and doing in Vietnam because I did not have a full deck of cards. I needed to have an understanding of the political and historical realities that brought us to Vietnam before I could make sense of what I was seeing. I began to acquire the other cards in the deck during the 3 years or so after I got back from Vietnam. But while I was there, nothing made sense because I kept trying to, play this game with 27 cards instead of 52 cards, and it kept not coming out right. And I didn't know why. All I knew was that it was nuts. I mean, it became clear within 3 or 4 months that my reasons for being in Vietnam were not clear. I mean, this notion of defending the people against these invaders from North Vietnam, the people hated me. The Vietnamese people hated me. And it was that was perfectly clear. I mean, people didn't say good morning to you. People didn't, people hated me. I know that some other people's experience was different, but in my own experience, the Vietnamese people hated me, and I gave them every reason to hate me. I beat them. I sometimes killed them. I destroyed their houses. I destroyed their crops. I destroyed their fields. I destroyed their culture. Why in the hell should those people like me? And I could see that I was doing that. And I could see that nothing we were doing was having any impact on the war itself. The funny thing about Vietnam is that I was getting Time magazine every week. It came in the mail. I could read about my war even as I sat in the middle of it. And I would read about what Lyndon Johnson would say and what McNamara would say and what Rusk would say. And I could look around and see that, I don't know what war they're talking about, but that's not what's going on here. We actually had an incident happen where one of our line companies stumbled upon a fairly large cache of Viet Cong weapons and ammunition. And I read in the Stars and Stripes, the daily newspaper that we received, this little action actually made it into the papers, and we read that we had set the Viet Cong effort back by at least 4 months in our area. Within a week of that article appearing in the paper, within 10 days of the incident itself, the bridge 150 meters in front of our battalion compound was dropped by Viet Cong sappers. An Amtrak coming in from the Horseshoe area from one of the line companies hit a 50-pound box mine. Several men were killed. A bunch more were wounded. A patrol out at Phuc Troc Bridge was ambushed. Several people were killed. Several people were wounded. I mean, nobody told the Viet Cong that they'd been set back for 4 months. And yet this is what you're reading in the newspapers. This is what you're being told back in the United States. I could see that the war went on day after day after day, interminably, at the same pace, no matter what we did. I'm wasting your film. When I left Vietnam, I was in the midst of the battle for Hue City during Tet, 1968. It was February '68, and I'd been up in the city for 2.5, 3 weeks, and I knew that my day was coming, but I wasn't sure when. And at that point, we weren't thinking about things like that. And we were in the middle of a low-key firefight. We were exchanging fire with some guys across the street from us out along the eastern, the northeast section of Hue City. What was left of my unit, the scouts, about 6 of us. And a Jeep comes hauling up the street along the river and whips into this little compound where we were and says, "Ehrhardt, your orders are in. Let's go." It was the lieutenant, my boss. And I well, I didn't exactly stand up, but I immediately began to strip off my gear and distribute it to the other guys who were there, and said, "So long, see you back in the world." Got on a Jeep. Last thing I saw of those guys, they were laying down covering fire for us. We burned our way back down the street. There was a chopper sitting on the LZ. I got on a bird, was up 3,000 feet above Way City 10 minutes after I knew I was on my way out. And went through some processing. They yanked me out early because one of my older brothers by this time had arrived in Vietnam, and they arranged for me to spend a couple of days with him. And I got back, in early March, came in at night, went through more processing, a place called Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay, and then I was free to go. And still had time in the Marines. I had a month's leave, basically, before I had to report to another duty station in North Carolina. And I got a taxi, and there I was, my first view of the United States, and I could hardly wait. And it was absolute impenetrable fog. We came across the Oakland Bay Bridge, couldn't see 10 feet, couldn't see anything. Got to the airport. There was part of what affected my coming back. I was happy to be alive, I was excited, but at the same time I was very ambivalent. I was afraid, partly because I had a girlfriend when I went over there, and in September, 8 months after I was there, I got a Dear John letter from her, and I kept hoping that I'd be able to fix this up once I got back. And I did not know what kind. And that woman, that girl, had become the focus of my life while I was in Vietnam. She had ceased to be a real person. She'd become this icon. And then, of course, she had sort of, said, take a hike. But you can't just let go of a vision like that, of the thing that has kept you going. So I was scared about all of that. I didn't know what I was going to find when I finally got back to the East Coast.
I'm Jim Ambrose, Jr. I'm from Norfolk, Massachusetts. Was born October 17th, 1967. I'm a veteran of Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. And as I mentioned to you just a few minutes ago, my dad's a Vietnam veteran, was in the Marine Corps, served in combat in Vietnam. And his best friend, Tom McNeil, was a jet pilot during the Vietnam War. So as a young kid, looked up to those guys, and just, like I said, I assumed that everybody went in and became a hero of sorts. And as I got older, I realized that wasn't true. But I was fortunate enough to get a ROTC scholarship to Holy Cross out in Worcester. It was a Marine Corps option Naval ROTC scholarship. And in return for them paying for 4 years of college, I had to serve 4 years in the Marine Corps. And at the time, it was the late 80s, when I was in ROTC and when I was in the basic school afterwards down in Quantico training, everything was geared toward big conventional war against the Russians over in, I guess what we assume would have been Europe at the time. And so there was no inkling of any sort of potential for conflict in the Middle East. And so it was really a shock when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I had to literally get out a map and look where Kuwait was. Didn't know quite anything about that neck of the woods. But to back it up, I guess after Holy Cross, I went to Quantico, which is where they train you for 6 months as a Marine. You learn all about the different aspects of being a lieutenant: combat arms, logistics, support, communications, that sort of thing. And as luck would have it, I was assigned to be a motor transport officer. I went to school down at Camp Lejeune, And as a motor transport officer, you're in charge of, you know, getting people and equipment from point A to point B. And I got assigned to Camp Pendleton out in Southern California, 1st Marine Division. And I had to report out there in, I think it was March of 1990. Drove across the country by myself with a new pickup truck I had bought. Eventually wound up renting a house with 2 other second lieutenants, Kevin Shea and Mike Gorman, 2 guys I had gone to the basic school with. And we had a great house with a view of the Pacific Ocean. Once I settled into a bit of a routine, you know, you'd show up at the base in the morning, do some training, and you'd be done by 4:35 each day. You'd come home, and then we'd have the weekends to goof off and go to the beach, go to clubs in San Diego or Los Angeles. So life was pretty good. I was assigned to the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion, which pretty crack unit. Recon is the eyes and ears of the 1st Marine Division. They generally operate 20, 30 miles out ahead of what's called the FEBA, the forward edge of the battle area. So I was working with, and I was around a lot of, you know, hard-charging recon Marines. I had been fortunate enough to go to jump school when I was in ROTC. I learned how to jump out of planes down in Fort Benning, Georgia. So eventually I did some parachute training with these recon guys, and it was a good unit, small, tight-knit unit. But as a second lieutenant, when you show up, everyone kind of looks at you funny. You have to prove yourself, you know. There's always a bit of a gauntlet to go through when you start out as a second lieutenant. You're expected to know what you're doing, and generally it takes a while before you do. You can go through all the training in the world, but Marines who've been in the fleet for a couple of years consider themselves pretty salty, and they see a second lieutenant show up. You know, they're going to test you about Vietnam, and they might as well have been Luke Skywalker talking about fighting the dark side in you know, Star Wars. They were real life superheroes, and to you know, I grew up in Norfolk, which is a sleepy suburb of Boston, and you know, like you could say life was fairly dull, and there was always that calling as a young man to kind of prove yourself and go out and see the world and go test yourself. And at some point, I picked up a book my dad had read called A Rumor of War by Phil Caputo. My dad didn't talk much about Vietnam when I was a kid, and for understandable reasons, but I was very curious about it as an adolescent kid, 12, 13 years old. But this book, Rumor of War, is about a Marine lieutenant. He talked about going to officer candidate school in Quantico and then eventually serving in Vietnam. And the way he described officer candidate school, how tough the DIs were and how they'd hit you and yell at you and make you do push-ups and run up and down these hills. On a day like today with a helmet on, up and down these hills in Quantico, it was like, wow, you can make it through that. You become like a Jedi Knight. That's how I looked at it. So there was some of that. I wanted to say, yeah, I did that, and, you know, prove myself. And, you know, my dad was still is a very strong male role model for me. And to just be able to do, I didn't think I'd end up doing what he did in Vietnam. Vietnam was a gruesome war in many ways. And part of me hoped I'd never had to see that, but part of me kind of hoped that, yeah, maybe I could, you know, deploy or do something, be part of history. But like I said, there wasn't a snowball's chance in hell in my mind that we were going to fight the Russians. It just seemed like we had our nukes pointed at them, they had their nukes pointed at us, and we were around just in case, you know. But you trained, and the Marine Corps takes being prepared very seriously, so it wasn't a laissez-faire attitude. But when we got word that we were going to Saudi Arabia, it was a big shock, you know. It came as a surprise, like I said. Well, you know, like I said, we had a routine on the weekends. We'd go to the beach. We had a great house. We had friends from 29 Palms, which is about 3 hours inland in California, and they would all come to the coast to hang out with us, to go to the beach and, you know, chase girls, go to clubs, that sort of thing. And we were on the beach, and my friend Frank Grimkowski, who was from 29 Palms, an infantry officer, said, hey, we just got alerted we have to report back to 29 Palms. They were 29 Palms is the desert, and the 7th Marines was the regiment he was part of. He said, I think something's going down. Something's happened in the Middle East. And I remember thinking, oh, geez, that sucks for you guys. I'm going to stay here at the beach. He went back to 29 Palms. That was like August 1990. Within a couple of weeks, though, the whole 1st Marine Division was mobilized. The whole base was, we found out, deploying. This was not going to be a small deployment. Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. He was threatening to take over Saudi Arabia, which would have given him control of a big percentage of the world's oil. I didn't understand that then. I've thought about it and read about it since then, but it was important to prevent him from going into Saudi Arabia. So that's why the Marines generally can get the most people to a hotspot in the world the fastest. You know, the Marine Corps, 1st Marine Division deployed, and the 82nd Airborne deployed, but they can't bring as much equipment as the Marines. The Marines come with ships, and they're prepared to fight right off the bat and supply themselves for at least 30 days, generally a fast-moving force of regiment size, generally.
Did you talk to your dad at all before?
Yeah, I did, and they were very upset. My parents, so August 2nd, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, and within a few short weeks, we got word we were going, you know, and there was a scramble, preparation, packing up equipment, new uniforms, shots, immunizations, and my 2 roommates, they both left before me. Kevin Shea was a comm officer with 9th Marines, with the comm battalion for the 1st Marine Division. And my other roommate was a supply officer with Force Recon. And they left before me, so I was by myself. My parents came out to visit, and it was nice to see them, but it was a little bit, you know, upsetting too. I could tell they were worried about me, particularly my dad, when he talked to you, you know, half a dozen of his friends were killed, and he saw dozens and dozens of people killed in Vietnam. So that was the backdrop. So it was a little bit of a melancholy visit. And he told me, just listen to your staff NCOs. Don't take any unnecessary risks. Protect your Marines. You know, there's only so much you can say. You know, no one knew what was going to happen. And the mission initially was to defend Saudi Arabia. And we joked when we first got there, we were a speed bump, you know. We were a small force that they thought might get run over by Saddam. You know, we were going to fight them, obviously, but so that was the mentality at the time. It was a big scramble. It was confusing, and not knowing exactly what was going to happen. We didn't know there'd be combat. We thought, well, we could just deploy there similar to what we have in Korea and just defend Saudi Arabia. We didn't know ultimately we'd be going into Kuwait. So the deployment, interestingly enough, the battalion packed up. That was a huge effort. We were a small unit, part of the 1st Marine Division. We convoyed up to El Toro, a Marine Corps air station about a half hour north of Camp Pendleton, and the battalion loaded all its gear up on 3 C-5A Galaxies, which is a humongous plane, one of the biggest in the world. I was the junior 2nd lieutenant in the battalion, and the first two plane loads left, and I was the last officer in charge of the 3rd plane. My commanding officer said, "You're in charge, you're in the last plane, make sure these Marines get on the plane and the equipment's on the plane." I said, "Aye, aye, sir." And as luck would have it, the plane we were on took off and had to turn around and come back for mechanical problems. And this is a bit of a deviation from the whole story here, but that happened again one more time. We took off and the plane broke down, there was problems, and we were sleeping on the runway. Me, a company of recon Marines in my motor transport platoon. Eventually we flew to Delaware, Dover, Delaware, and the pilot said to me, "Hey, this plane's got a lot of problems. You're going to be here for a while." So they worked all night on the plane. We took off from Dover, Delaware, again, turned around and landed at like 2 o'clock in the morning. And I'm thinking, geez, I'm going to die before we even get over there, you know? They fixed the plane up again, and so we're 3 days behind the rest of my unit. I'm like, well, how am I going to know where to go when we get over there? Took off from Dover. Eventually, this time, the plane proceeded onward, flew all night over the ocean. C-5A is a huge plane. It's loaded with trucks and equipment and pallets down below. And up in the very rear of the plane, there's like a movie theater seating. I think we were facing rearward. I'm not quite sure, but it was dark and there are no windows. There's one small window. So it was a long, hot, boring flight. And we landed in Germany, Rhine-Main, Germany. Slept for 6 or 7 hours in this giant field house. A couple guys were able to do laundry. It was a big army hangar. They had like machines, like Coke machines, but you could buy cans of beer out of them. A couple guys bought some cans of beer out of these machines. And then we took off from Germany, landed in Italy somewhere. I'm going to assume it was Aviano. I'm not sure. We didn't get out of the plane. They just refueled. And then we went to Saudi Arabia. So you're talking 3 or 4 days of time, and total time in the air probably, I don't know, 20 hours. Long time. And you're in the same desert uniform, and you got your gear. And another side note, before you deploy overseas, they gave us a whole bunch of shots. One of the shots they give you is called a gamma globulin shot. It's supposed to boost your immunity system. And they give it to you right in one of your butt cheeks, right? And it swells up like a tennis ball. And it's painful, you know. It boosts your immune system with a bunch of stuff that's supposed to prevent you from catching diseases in foreign countries. So you're sitting on your butt in a canvas seat, or not so comfortable a seat, for 20 hours in a plane. I remember that being a little bit of a problem. But eventually we rolled out and landed at the King Fahd International Airport in northern Saudi Arabia. About 4 o'clock in the morning. It was dark out, and we sat on the runway waiting to go up to the terminal area. And then the sun started coming up. It started getting real hot in the plane. Then they opened the door. It was probably 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. It was hot, real hot. And we got out of the plane and kind of walked up to a big staging area. Tons of activity going on. Hundreds, thousands of troops landing. There were Army troops, Marine troops. There were helicopters coming and going. And it was hot, you know. It was dusty. Wind was blowing. It was stifling heat, 90 to 100 degrees. But, you know, I was nervous, trying to find out where to go, what to do. There was no one there to greet me. And I just kind of put our guys in a particular area. There were some pallets of bottled water, which I had never seen or drank from before, and they had Arabic writing on them, and they handed them out to us, and they were hot, but you drank it to just be hydrated. Again, the noise, the smell, and the sound, it was big. You could tell there was just a ton of people coming in country. And there were, you know, guys driving, local guys, you know, Saudi Arabian guys driving forklifts and trucks and tractors around. They had, you know, like the headgear that a Saudi Arabian, a Muslim guy would wear, and they had like long white robe type things, and they were covered in dirt. And I said, well, I'm not in Norfolk, Mass anymore. This is a different country. And that's what guys would wear, you know, native folks over there. So they were helping unload the planes.
So you felt like you were part of something big.
It was huge, yeah, it was huge. And again, I'm the second lieutenant, just hoping that my unit hasn't forgotten about me. I don't know where they are at this point. I have pictures I'll show you, just airline plane after airline plane. Every 10 minutes someone would land and 100+ guys would get out. And like me, they'd be standing around wondering what's happened. So there were thousands of people coming in. And it's hot, you're in a uniform, it's disorienting, and you know.
At the same time, you must be feeling like, okay, like we're here.
Yeah.
Let's go.
There was a little of that. Again, the uncertainty is tough to explain, you know. Will I ever get home again? Is this my last place I'm going to see on the planet Earth? I don't know. And it was a barren, desolate area where we were. There's a giant airport. It wasn't like Logan Airport where you walk off a little causeway and get into an you get out of the plane and you stood around on the runway. Eventually, after half a day, my CO came. His name was Captain Bob Putt. So, all right, I flew home. My parents greeted me at the airport. I think I wore a uniform, I didn't have to, but I did wear one, and they gave me a big hug, and my mother said to me, "We were planning your funeral." My father's like, "Don't tell him that. Geez, what are you saying that for?" But it was, you know, emotional for everybody. My brother and sister were there. We went out to eat, and my dad set up a party at the house in Norfolk. It was a little embarrassing, but everybody came. It was good. It was, you know, a blip, really. It just seemed like, wow, it worked out almost too perfectly, because wars, as we saw very quickly after that in Iraq and in Afghanistan, they generally don't go that smoothly, you know. And the circumstances of Kuwait, the Iraqis were really in exposed positions, and there was just a perfect target for our firepower to hit, destroy, and annihilate. And Saddam's forces really trying to take us on conventionally was a gross mismatch, and that's why it worked out as well as it did. When you get into urban warfare and guerrilla tactics and that sort of stuff, no matter how big and powerful you are, you're going to take casualties, which we did later on in the Iraq War, early 2000s. So I remember thinking, geez, after Desert Storm, who's going to want to screw with us? Look at what we did. There's not going to be any more wars again. But it was naive, and I was just glad we got back in one piece, and I managed to have a couple of years in California without much more angst, you know. So
how did that change your relationship with your dad, or did it?
Yeah, definitely did. Just going into the Marines and going through Quantico, going to OCS, he was certainly more open to talking about his experiences, and I could understand what going to the rifle range was like, going to the gas chamber and practicing how to use your gas mask, or going on these hikes up and down the hills of Quantico. I went through that stuff I read about in the book, and so we were part of the same club, and it was good. I think definitely could share those experiences. And then my dad, Tom McNeil, myself, and some other Marines from the Boston area, every November at the Marine Corps birthday, we would go to this luncheon in Boston. It's a pretty big deal. And you'd sit with other Marines, and we were all part of the same kind of fraternity. It was neat. I was honored to be part of that club. I still felt like a junior varsity guy with Desert Storm compared to Vietnam, but hey, it was something. And I just happened to be in at the time when that happened, and some of my friends didn't go to Kuwait, didn't go to Desert Storm. They came in after, or their unit didn't deploy for whatever reason, and I think some of them felt bad and wished they had gone. But the military's like that, you know. Sometimes it's a roulette wheel of sorts. Sometimes you get good deals, sometimes you get bad deals, and you know, there's a whole myriad of experiences you can have. So I'm lucky I get in and get out of there in one piece, but it's definitely one of the most significant thing in my life, I guess, other than being a dad or being a husband. I think that 7 months in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, certainly pretty seminal moment.
I was born and raised in Rock Island, Illinois, about 3 hours west of Chicago on the Illinois-Iowa border.
Quad Cities.
Yeah, the Quad Cities. And raised there until college and then the Army, pretty much. So.
When and why did you join the service?
Joined the Army shortly after 9/11, partially because of that and partially because I was a really terrible college student. I spent about 4 years in college, 3 different schools, jumping around, not doing well, and decided I need to get a little bit of discipline in my life finally. And Army was a logical choice. They happened to have a great program for me to go straight into Special Forces right out of, if I qualified for everything and made it through all of the hurdles, I could go straight off the street into Army Special Forces.
So that was an interest of yours right off the bat.
I wouldn't say it was an interest right off the bat, but it was something that was presented to me after I had taken some tests, the Army entry exam, and qualified at a high level, and I was identified as a good candidate for the program. I had no idea that it existed prior to me walking into the recruiter's office.
Hopefully this is not state secrets, but what are they looking for in Special Forces?
Looking for this qualification, you had to be able to physically pass the Army Physical Fitness exam prior to joining the military, which most people don't have to pass this until they finish basic training. For this program, you had to pass it before you even join the Army. So you already had to be in a decent shape. And then they were looking for a general technical score on the ASVAB of 110 or higher, which basically qualifies you for any job in the military. I went initially to Fort Benning, Georgia for small unit basic training and infantry training, and then airborne school, and then was transferred to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where I did a special operations preparation course and selection, and all through the Army Special Forces candidate school. And then I actually stayed there. I got stationed after the Green Beret School at Fort Bragg.
What was the toughest part of the training, whether in the beginning or as you got into Special Forces?
For me, the toughest part of the training was the running. I was a really terrible runner. No, but seriously, I think the toughest part of it is really just not quitting. And I think that's what gets most people, is the mental toughness. You have an opportunity to stop training at any time that you want. And that's what gets most of the people injuries and just quitting, basically. It's a mental thing. And I was able to get through that by basically deciding that I didn't want to be down the street at the 82nd or any other infantry unit. Not that there's anything wrong with them, but I wanted to be with the Special Forces, and if I gave up, there was no chance of that happening. So.
Did you think about it a few times?
Not really. I actually saw some other people quit early on, and that actually drove me more to not want to do it. I don't think it ever occurred to me that, that was an option for me. That seemed more like failure than another option.
And that will play well into the story that we're going to talk about a little bit later, that refusal to give up. What was it like to get that Green Beret?
It was about 3 years in the making, so it was pretty, it was almost like graduating from college, only much more rigorous mentally and physically, I think. That was it's one of the great accomplishments of my life so far, I think. Hopefully other things will surpass that, but at that time it was definitely one of the greatest things that I've done personally as far as accomplishment.
And when did you finish that?
That was 2005 is when I actually graduated from the course in 2004, and then still had to go through language school and survival, escape, resistance, and evasion, or SEER, after that. So I didn't get out of the entire course until 2005.
And then it was pretty quick after that you were deployed to Iraq, correct?
Pretty much immediately. I showed up at my team and my company at Fort Bragg, and they were already deployed to Iraq. And so it took me a couple weeks to get all of my processing done and get all my equipment, and I met my team downrange.
unit were you attached to?
3rd Special Forces Group. I was on ODA 3336. When I first joined, it was 396, and then they changed the naming convention of all the teams. It became 3336.
So 2005, things are not great in Iraq. You're kind of starting to see the sectarian violence and the insurrection from all the different factions inside Iraq. What were your primary duties during that deployment?
Yeah, definitely a lot of turmoil in Iraq at that time. Our team was based in Tal Afar, which is up in the northeast, northwest, west of Mosul, which if you pay attention to the news lately, you've seen Mosul as the haven of ISIS and stuff like that. So Tal Afar is not too far away from there. And when I showed up on base, onto the team, they basically told me, get ready, tomorrow we're going to take over the city. It had been overtaken by insurgents at the time. And we had a mission along with the 5th Infantry Division at that time to go in and basically take back the city from terrorist control. And so that was my second day in Iraq, was going in and taking the city. It certainly was not as intense as what I know of Fallujah, but that's what we were prepared to go into, is a Fallujah-style battle.
What's your mental state going into your first real combat?
I was scared. I really didn't know what to suspect. I'd been in the military for 3 years now, and I'd basically been in training for the entire time. I've done a little bit of role playing in some combat situations and stuff, a lot of it actually, but nothing really prepares you for the fact, knowing that real life bullets could be flying at you. And also I'm on a new team with people that I just met the day before, and we're going into a combat, real live combat situation. And I'm not the only person that this, this story is not unique to me for sure. But it was definitely, there's a lot going through my mind at that time. All the things that I didn't know and things that could go wrong. And
was there any confusion as a result of the fact that you hadn't worked together before, or is the training in Special Forces so consistent that everything kind of falls into place?
There's definitely confusion. I mean, again, I've only been in training, so I hadn't worked in real life with any of these people. I didn't know the unit SOPs. I didn't know how these guys acted in any situation, really. And so it was, I was the new guy on the team, even though I was, an E5 at the time. I'm still like basically a private, essentially, in the eyes of the rest of the guys on my team. And they treated me like that. And made sure that I knew what I was doing. And so there's a great deal of leadership, but there's also a lot of figure it out and make things happen. So, within a couple days, I was driving the vehicles. I didn't get out and do as much patrolling as, some of the guys that had been around for a while. I was driving the vehicles and making sure I'm pulling security and all that stuff. So one of the things that I think they learned in Fallujah is, and I think because there were some issues with civilian casualties and stuff like that. So they actually made announcements, hey, we're coming into the city, and you can debate whether or not that's a great tactic for, rooting out insurgents. But there were announcements made, we're coming in to take over the city. If you're, still here after such date, you'll be considered you're considered an enemy combatant. And so with that, a lot of people, not only civilians, but also some of the potential insurgents, just decided to leave town and not fight us and then come back another day. So we went in and we definitely did have some firefights, from the more extreme or extreme fighters that wanted to stay in town. But we had so much fire superiority that we generally didn't feel too threatened by a lot of it. Yeah, so this was about a 3 or 4 day operation. We had left the fire base and pretty much stayed down in the town of Talifar for that whole time. So it was really a lot of action for my first week, basically, in country. Trial by fire, and kind of thrown in the deep end, so to speak. So I learned a lot, and coming back from that, there was a lot of camaraderie built just in a few days of being out there on the mission. And so I was able to come back and already start to feel part of the team. And then on top of that, start to feel, I made it through my first combat mission, and I didn't die. So there was, a little bit of success. I felt success, and pretty much all units, especially in the military, there is a great bit of camaraderie, and you hear stories about this all the time. But I think in the Special Forces, it's forged even a little bit deeper. You're on a 12-man team. You spend a lot of time with just those 12 guys. And then on top of that, you're going through some of the most intense situations that anybody has ever experienced. And so those sorts of the bonds forged under battle are sometimes greater than, I don't know what you compare it to, maybe a fraternity or something like that. It's definitely something that you can't identify with others on that. And you see that with veterans a lot. They'll only talk to other veterans about their stories because they feel that person can kind of understand it. I think it's even more so in the Special Forces and some of these elite fighting units.
What else stands out to you from your time in Iraq? Where did you go after that? What other areas did you serve?
So we stayed in that general area for Iraq, spent the mission, or the 6 months that I was there, training up some Iraqi soldiers up in the Talifar area so that they could kind of take over the area. And then...
What was that like? Because there are some stories ranging from competent to completely clueless. What was your
Sure.
experience?
Well, we had some special operations guys that were top-notch. They would stand up to any Special Forces unit in most countries. And then we also had some guys that you may have seen in a video on YouTube doing jumping jacks. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy in the quality of soldiers, but you get that even in fully developed countries. So yeah, we saw the gamut of it. Ours were middle of the road, perhaps, but we were able to be successful in training them to be a self-sustaining force. Well, I'm not going to get political about it at all, but it is, it was disheartening kind of to see how much effort and how many lives have been lost over there, to see it just very easily go into ISIS control. It's a kick in the pants, kind of, and I can understand why a lot of people have real issues with that, because a lot of it is based on decision making and not just, a power vacuum necessarily. But yeah, it's tough to watch, but you also know that you were there for each other and there for hopefully the right reasons. And it is what it is. You just deal with it,
Just a few seconds before we have to take a break. Between Iraq and the Afghan deployment, where we'll spend the bulk of our interview after the break, there was a first deployment to Afghanistan. What was the mission?
Yeah, the mission there was to train a Afghan police unit. So we went in there and we had about 20 police officers in Gardez on the eastern side of Afghanistan. And we basically just trained them for 7 months and to make them be able to police their own territory. There was a little bit of combat during that one, but nothing super, real significant like my second deployment to Afghanistan. The biggest difference to me between Iraq and Afghanistan is the people. Obviously, there's a cultural difference and a development difference. Iraq is much more developed than Afghanistan is as a whole. Certainly there are some pockets of Afghanistan that are well developed, but generally it's a third world country. Iraq is very Iraq is well developed, but not fully, and I don't think that they appreciated the American presence there, if I could say. I honestly don't have, I don't think very highly of my time in Iraq or of the Iraqi people in general that I interacted with. Whereas Afghanistan, maybe it's because I spent more time there, or maybe it's because the people are different, but I felt like I could get behind the Afghanistan mission a little bit more, and the people seemed to genuinely, some of the people anyway, seemed to be happy that the Americans were there and think that we were there to help them. It was a much more cooperative effort.
Let's talk about April 6th, 2008, which, as we tape this, is 9 years ago.
9 years ago today.
That's right. So, what was the mission?
The mission was, well, first off, let me back up a little bit. During this entire deployment, our team had been given a huge mission as far as Special Forces missions go, to train the very first Kandak, which is basically a battalion of Afghan commandos. So Afghanistan had never had a special operations force prior, and our 12-man ODA was to stand up the first battalion of Afghan commandos. This is 700 guys. So it was a huge deal, and we had a lot of people looking at our missions in general, not just this specific one, but as the whole mission. And so every month we took these guys from basically infantry unit to a special operations unit, and every month the missions would get a little bit more intense, a little higher level targets, go from essentially a training mission to a full-blown operation, which this on April 6, 2008 was Operation Commando Wrath, the largest and most high-profile mission that the Afghan commandos had ever been on. And we were there to advise and lead through combat these guys to take out a high-level HIG commander by the name of Haji Ghafoor. So not only did we have to climb the mountain, but we had to fly to the mountain. We were based out of Jalalabad, and this valley, Shuk Valley, Kendall Village, was a long helicopter flight from Jalalabad deep in the mountains of Nuristan. First thing we had to do is get across the river that they dropped us on the wrong side of. Because we had a large contingent of Afghan commandos that were still somewhat inexperienced, the leadership decided that we should not fast rope onto the mountain and into the houses, but instead we would land in the valley and work through the valley and then up the mountain to the target. There was a lot of pushback from leadership on our team and our team leaders to not do the mission that way, but ultimately it was decided that that's how it was going to be done. And so the first thing that we had to do was cross this river, which anybody that's been in the military knows that you don't want to get wet if you can help it. So that was the first kick in the pants, so to speak, was to have to get wet immediately after touching on the ground. Then we had to move towards the mountain and then start basically scaling up this mountain, which if you're familiar with Afghan towns built into mountains, it was very steep and sort of a tiered approach. They build gardens and basically all of their agriculture into the side of the mountain in little levels, but they're 6, 8, 12 feet ledges. And we were basically climbing up one of these, and it was essentially mountain climbing in some places. We were taking our packs off and handing them to the person above us or below us and climbing up and pulling these packs up. Like, not the ideal situation if you have to get into a firefight. I was about halfway up. I was with the command element, so the team leader. I was the the communications guy on the team, so I had the radio that day. We also had our lead translator and our combat cameraman and our air traffic controller, our JTAC, Joint Tactical Air Controller. They were all part of the command element, and so we were in about the middle of the pack. We had a bunch of Afghans and part of our team up ahead of us, and then some in blocking positions and behind us. The enemy combatants not only had the high ground, but they had us almost surrounded, and we were in sort of a bowl in the terrain there, and they had dug in fighting positions. No Americans, no Westerners had ever been to this village. I don't even believe that the Russians were there when they were in Afghanistan. So we really had little idea what we were really going into. We knew the terrain was going to be bad. We didn't know it was going to be that bad, but we didn't know what we were walking into as far as, how many enemy combatants and what the situation would be like. And we were completely exposed on the mountainside. There was almost no cover from where the enemy could just shoot at us. A few rock outcroppings here and there, maybe a felled tree, but generally you're just out in the open.
So how did you protect yourself, and how did you try to fight back?
So the way that the battle started, one of our teammates came across the radio and said, "Hey, I see a couple guys with an RPG." And our team sergeant gave the instruction over the radio to take them out. And we knew once one bullet goes, the firefights can start. So we sort of prepared a little bit, but again, there was nowhere really to hide. And we didn't know where all of the insurgents were. We heard over the radio from aircraft in the area that there were a bunch of combatants gathering on rooftops and spreading around to different buildings and everything. But we didn't know where they were. We couldn't really see them from our position. So once the gunfire started, bullets immediately started impacting around the command element where I was. And the only thing that we could do at the time was there was a small rock outcropping to our left as we're climbing up the mountain. And we all quickly jumped, about 4 or 5 of us jumped underneath this rock outcropping. And it immediately became clear that that was not a safe place. Bullets were impacting right around my feet. And our Afghan interpreter was shot in the neck right next to me. So, I made the quick decision that I needed to get out of there, dropped to a knee, started firing in the position or the area where I believe the fire to be coming from so that I could suppress it and move to a better covered position. And as I got up to move from that position and towards a felled tree, I was hit in the hip with a gunshot through my femoral head, the ball and socket of my pelvis.
And from what I've read, the pain was instant and excruciating.
Yeah, I always compare it to, not that I've been hit by a car, but kind of like being hit by a car and electrocuted at the same time.
Describe the electrocution part of that.
Yeah, so it was more like a reverberation because the bullet had hit my bone, and in a very solid part of it, like a reverberation through my entire body as I fell to the ground. That was that's the best way that I can describe it.
At that point, are you even thinking? Are you still thinking about the mission? Are you thinking about your being exposed? Are you thinking about dealing with the pain? What's going through your mind at this point?
Yeah, at that point, it's hard to think about anything, about the mission anymore at that point. I think, some guy, later on I was shot through the bicep, and that was a minor injury that I could have fought through. But being hit in basically the ball and socket of my hip, there's nothing else to think about. My initial thought was that this was a life-threatening injury, that I had been shot exactly where the femoral artery is, and that I was going to bleed out in a minute. Because we've seen videos of that. We all train for what to do in that situation, but it seemed like the worst-case scenario at that point.
So what happened next?
So after that, some of my teammates started making their way towards me. One of the guys on my team, Luis Morales, finally made it to my position and started rendering aid. He was trying to put pressure on my hip, even using his knee and putting some rags in there and using his knee to keep pressure on it. And while he was doing that, he was actually shot while he was giving aid to me. So I had my hand up like so, so that he could get in here, and was leaning against the felled tree, and a bullet came through my bicep and went straight into Luis's leg. And so now we have two guys, plus our interpreter, who at this point was dead, two Americans in very close proximity, critically injured. And then shortly after that, Luis was hit by a second bullet that went through his ankle and shattered his ankle. So he's effectively out of the mission as well.
With them having, again, the high ground, you don't have any place to protect yourselves. The rest of your team's focusing on you guys and trying to get you out of there, I'm guessing, at this point.
I think at this point, the gunfire was still so strong that we hadn't even thought about getting out of there yet. We're still trying to take control of this battle. We did not, one of the things that we always do or try to do in any situation, and that's why we have the gun trucks and air fire, air power, is we want to take over the fire superiority, right? We want to be throwing more bullets downrange than they are at us to keep their heads down so that we can move to a better position. We were unable to gain fire superiority for a long time in this battle, which is not where we're used to operating from.
And this went on for the battle went on for about 6 hours?
The battle went on for about 6 hours. It didn't take us that long to get fire superiority, but it was a long time before we were able to feel like we had a little bit of control over the battlefield.
And despite all the disadvantages, other than your interpreter, the rest of your unit survives, and there's about 150 of them, the enemy, that were killed?
Yeah, it depends on which book you read or who you ask, but I think the estimates are there were about 200 of them, and maybe 150 of them were killed. We had 4 guys on our team, 4 Americans, that were critically injured. One guy, his leg was basically effectively amputated at just below the knee, and another guy, our team sergeant, was shot through the arm and had a lot of nerve damage from that. We also had several other Purple Hearts on the team for relatively minor injuries.
Absolutely amazing. As the 6 hours played out, what were you doing?
Trying to live.
Because you thought at one point this was it.
Yeah, so myself and Luis had been moved a little bit around the corner there to a relatively safer position. And from there, our medic, Ron Schur, was able to get down to us and start giving us aid. Ron administered morphine and some other life-saving aid to us. And in the course of, I don't know, a half hour, an hour of, just stabilizing, the team sergeant was shot through the arm, and John Walding was shot through the leg, and we were all about 10 feet away from each other. So where I had initially been shot started becoming, it was just a death trap. Everybody that was coming in there was getting shot, and it was almost impossible to get out of there. So we ended up having to go down the back side of the mountain. There was not a trail. It was, okay, we're going to drop you down this cliff, and hopefully it doesn't hurt anything worse.
How far are we talking about here?
20, 30-foot ledges. We would have one guy go down below, and one guy would literally, and I have no clothes on at this point, pretty much. They put my body armor back on, and my leg is hanging, it's the skin and muscle is all still there, but I have no bone in my hip, and we didn't know, that it very easily could have severed an artery or something. But they would hold me down by the shoulder straps of my Kevlar and then drop me the rest of the way.
You're just bouncing off the mountain?
Yeah, pretty much. It was excruciating.
Do you remember that?
Oh yeah, that's one of the, that was as painful as getting shot.
I can't even imagine.
Even though I already had the morphine running through me, that kind of brought it all back. It was pretty bad. After we finally made it down to the bottom, we still had to wait for the helicopters to come in and pick us up. So we were waiting on everybody to get down to the casualty collection point at the bottom of the base, and it took a little while for that to happen. So I was one of the first guys to get down to the bottom, but then we still had to get the other guys that had been wounded down there. And it seemed to me, and I have very little concept of time over this whole thing, it was 6-7 hours, but to me, I have no idea how long it was for me. So once I got down there, then they started calling in the helicopters. And it took a couple tries for the helicopters to get in. The first time, I thought that they were coming in to pick me up. My medic had told me that I was the first one out of there. And the helicopter came in, and it got very close to touching down and took off without picking anybody up. Turned out that the helicopter was being shot at by the guys that were still out there fighting us, and rounds were getting pretty close to the pilot. I think he may have even gotten hit. So he had to get out of there quick, and then a few minutes later, after they had secured a little bit, dropped a few more bombs, another helicopter was able to come in, but then they picked up a couple of my teammates and took off without me, and I was like, what the heck, what's going on? I thought I was the first one out of here. But turns out one of the other guys I had stabilized a little bit, and he was progressing a little bit worse. So I had to wait for the third helicopter to come in, and finally got on the bird. A couple of the guys carried me across the river again, and I actually got wet again on the way out. And then got on the bird, and immediately they started, the crew on the Black Hawk started working on me and stripping me down and everything, and injecting me with everything. And then we took off, and I got one last look as we were pulling up out of the valley. I was able to kind of lean back, and I was on the floor of the Black Hawk, and kind of look over my shoulder and see the valley below me. And just like any mountain range from the bird's eye view, it's beautiful. But at the same time, like, I knew that this was like hell on earth, that I had just follow on operations to rectify that issue. So.
And I assume you were evacuated either to Germany or back to the States?
Yeah, so initially I went back to Bagram, and they did some initial triage and stabilization. And then I was evacuated to Landstuhl, Germany, and then back to Walter Reed, along with the 3 other critically injured teammates. So 4 of us went to Walter Reed together.
And what was required to heal you there?
I spent 2 months in the hospital, a few weeks in intensive care. And part of the problem was that I had, my intestines were an external fixator on my hip so that I wouldn't move it for about 2 months. Then I was released from the hospital and I had to stay on base primarily in a wheelchair and had a little walker, but I had no hip. I was just kind of hanging out with a dangling leg. I was a little worried that I might not ever be able to walk again, but in September 2009 or 2008, I had my hip replaced. So now I have a prosthetic hip, and was able to start doing physical therapy and rehab right after that. And you know, it took a little while to get going, but once I got to the point where I could walk without any assistive devices and I could start moving my knee again, just kind of, you know, went for it, and I've made as close to a full recovery as I think I can. It hasn't held me back in hardly any ways, and I've been very, very fortunate to have gone through such a terrible, life-threatening injury, and not only lived to tell about it, but, you know, lived to, I mean, most people have no idea that I'm injured, that I have a prosthetic hip, any of that stuff. So I've been fortunate to recover very well from it.
How are your buddies doing?
Most of the buddies are doing really well. Most of the guys have gotten out of the military now and moved on. Some of them have, you know, naturally retired. Some of them medically retired, as I did. Some just got out in regular ways. All doing great things now. One of, you know, the medic that saved my life, he is a Secret Service agent. You know, other guys are running their own businesses, stuff like that, doing, you know, amputees, doing triathlons, and, you know, everybody's raising families. So life goes on.
So fully functioning.
Yep.
Veterans. Just a little bit of time left. I don't know if this was a result of your own rehab, but I know you started a nonprofit gym at Walter Reed. Explain how that idea came about.
Yeah, while I was at Walter Reed, I had started doing CrossFit a little bit before I got injured and wanted to get back into it as part of my physical therapy. So I was fortunate to have a physical therapist that did CrossFit, and so we would start going over to the gym after our physical therapy sessions and just start doing workouts. Well, that made me realize that that was a great way to rehab for myself, at least. And I figured that there are a lot of other veterans or service members that were injured like that could benefit. So when I got out of the military and moved to Arlington, I linked up with my coach at my local gym, and we decided to go to Walter Reed and just start offering classes. And it eventually turned into a nonprofit where we got sponsorship from CrossFit headquarters. The military gave us a warehouse on base, and we built a gym at Walter Reed called CrossFit Walter Reed. And we used it to specifically help wounded service members who are recovering at Walter Reed, you know, find another outlet for their physical therapy and recovery.
What's the response been?
Response was great. We actually shut it down about a year ago as the war is kind of dwindling. Not as much interest, and, you know, it was completely voluntary, and we didn't have people really showing up anymore. So it served its purpose, and we ended up, you know, moving the equipment on to another gym. Another amputee took the equipment and started a gym elsewhere to do sort of the same mission. But it's been personally, I think that's one of the coolest things that I've done with my life, as far as, you know, serving others. So I'm really proud of that and what it evolved into and the other things that it inspired. Silver Star, I mean, it's great to be honored, but honestly, I'm not the hero of the day. The other guys on my team are the ones that saved my life. I lived through it, but you know, I'm honored to receive the Silver Star, of course. But again, like I said, the other guys on the ODA were the heroes that day.
What are you most proud of about your service?
I think, honestly, I think it's more about what I did after with Walter Reed. I think being able to go through all of that and come out the other side, and then be able to you know, transfer some of that knowledge and experience, and be able to give back to others. It gave me being injured on that day gave me a different sense of, you know, how important relationships are, and things like that, things that I kind of took for granted before. So I think that's what's made me most proud is, yes, my service was pretty cool, and I'm very proud of, you know, getting through the Special Forces qualification course and doing all of those things. But really, the person that it's made me since is, I think, something to be proud of.
Well, I grew up in Illinois in the north suburbs of Chicago, and went to high school in that city of Waukegan. And after a not so stellar high school career, decided to enlist in the Marines. I got roped in like most young Marines do, and was very enamored by the whole glitz and glamour of the Marine Corps. And I led a pretty risky lifestyle growing up. Rode a motorcycle, ran from the cops, got in my share of fights, and I met the Marines. And they seemed like this great big group of risk takers, and I figured these guys are perfect. They're a perfect fit for me. And I enlisted, did 4 years, kind of figured out the error of my ways, and decided I needed to get a college education, and went to Illinois State University, and I graduated in 3 years. And I tell people that because I attribute that success in college, Greg, to the fact that the discipline I learned as a young Marine, what that organization does for young people, especially those who may have steered off course a little bit with limited supervision, I think is irreplaceable. And I attribute all my success to that. I got my commission as an infantry officer, and at 24 years and after 10 deployments and traveling to over 60 different countries, and it was an amazing journey. And I was either a Marine or leading Marines the entire time, which I'm extremely proud to say.
Amazing. 2 quick follow-ups. You're from the northern suburbs. I assume you're a Cubs fan.
I am a Cubs fan.
Good man.
Correct.
Good man.
Not a huge sports fan, but I will go for the Cubs.
Why the Marines?
I joined the Marines just because they were the first ones that got their claws into me, I think. Honestly, I knew nothing about the military. I knew nothing about what went on in the Marine Corps other than the good-looking uniforms they wore, and the office of the recruiters I went to was painted camouflage, and there was camouflage netting over the desks, and I thought, these guys are where I need to be.
They meant business.
They did, yeah. They were all business.
Desert Storm. You mentioned this in the introduction to the book. Obviously, a relatively brief military operation, but explain what unit you were with then and what your role was.
Yeah, so when I was a young enlisted Marine, and we got orders to fight in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, everyone was very excited, as most young Marines are, because it had been since Vietnam, since Panama, maybe Grenada, those brief punctuated conflicts, where we knew we were going to a full-on war, and we were very excited to fight. And it wasn't the grand scale of battle that I experienced later on in my career. And as I write, I don't say this to diminish the service, but it was over so quickly. It was almost a very forgettable experience because we pushed through so rapidly. The surrender occurred. But the Marines that I fought alongside, I still keep in touch with them to this day. I was on the phone with one just this morning who was congratulating me on the book success for Echo and Ramadi. And it's a very unique brotherhood. And we were very proud of our service. But that operation, Desert Shield and Desert Storm, was very pale in comparison to future combat deployments that I experienced, where the intensity of the fighting was much heavier. the level of kinetics where we were bringing the full weight of the military to bear, and the fact that we were doing it in an urban environment made it vastly different than what I experienced as a young guy in Desert Shield and Desert Storm.
After Desert Storm, is that when you moved from enlisted to officer?
Yes, after Desert Storm, I had several months left on my contract, but I had started researching universities because I did want to get an education. I had some good leaders and mentors that said, Scott, you should look into this. And there was also a massive drawdown in the military at that time because we operate on this sine wave of post-war, pre-war, where the force numbers go up and we had a force reduction, and there were some lat moves going on where they change you from one job to the next, and none of them seemed appealing to me. So I decided to get out, go to college, and I still stayed connected to the Marine Corps even in college when I was a machine gunner with weapons company in the Chicago area. So I still stayed connected, and then once I graduated, I got my commissioning program through the basic officer candidates class, and Greg, to be honest, I really fell into that one as well, and I had ambitions as a criminal justice science major working for the federal government. And again, there was a hiring freeze, but a young, motivated sergeant called me up and said, I have your package, Scott. We'd love it if you could go to OCS in January, and I didn't hesitate, and I'm so glad I made that decision because it was probably one of the best in my life.
At what point did you get put in charge of a company?
Well, I got put in charge of a company of Marines at the same time every other captain does. You go through several different levels of command. The Marine Corps entrusts only the very best to command young Marines, men and women in combat or in training. And they go through almost a year of their lives in preparatory school in Quantico, Virginia, before they're given that opportunity to step in front of a platoon Marines as that first step. And throughout that, they're assigned various levels of leadership with increased responsibility. And obviously, you prove yourself, you do well, but everyone has the same opportunities. And after you do several leadership billets and train yourself and show your potential for future leadership, then you're sent to follow-on schools and then selected to command at the company level. And that happens normally after you graduate from the Expeditionary Warfare School. And again, in Quantico, Virginia, they send you back and you're selected. Not everybody gets selected, though. I'm not going to say it's a 100% guarantee, but those that are selected, I think it's important to note for viewers and listeners that the young men and women that enlist right out of high school, like I did, you really don't see it, but now I have the perspective to understand that our military organizations, service-wide, they have the best leadership at every level, including those junior officers, all the way through general officers.
Well, let's talk about Echo and Ramadi. Echo refers to Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines. When did you get the orders that you were headed to Iraq?
Well, when I left school, I actually had to graduate early. The battalion was on orders. They were going to deploy, and they needed to staff all the rifle companies with commanders so they would be at their full strength. So I didn't get to walk across the stage like all the other captains. I was shoved a diploma in my briefcase, said, hey, you got to go check in. So I packed my vehicle, left my wife in Virginia again, and then headed straight across country to Camp Pendleton from Virginia. I parked my Jeep in the parking lot. I checked in on a Wednesday, took command on a Friday, and then the next week we were in the high desert training for war. Shortly thereafter, we were on board the USS Boxer, WASP amphibious class ship, when the 15th Marine Expeditionary Commander, Colonel Brian Boudreau, stepped out on the 10th of November, the Marine Corps birthday, and told us that we just got official orders that the 15th ME was going into Iraq as part of the surge strategy that had just been ordered by President George W. Bush and General David Petraeus. So we stood there on the flight deck of the Boxer, bright sunny day, steaming ahead, and 2,000 Marines just let loose because, again, these are young guys. It's their first time, and they all had been training so hard for game day, and they were about to go into the Super Bowl of combat. So,
did you know you were headed to Ramadi at that point, or did those orders come later?
we knew we were going to Ramadi. The 15th MEU itself was comprised of 2,500 Marines and sailors, and once we were pushed into the country of Iraq, they really farmed out the 15th MEU. So some of the units went north. The aviation units were spread to Al-Assad and Camp Korean Village out to the west part of Al-Anbar province. And then 2 infantry companies were sent to Ramadi to support the 1st Brigade combat team with the Ready First. And that was Echo Company, my company, and then Fox Company, which was commanded by a good friend of mine, John Smith. And we worked exclusively for the Army. And the reason they did that was because Iraq at the time, and for several years, was essentially a giant game of whack-a-mole. The insurgency and these hardcore fighters would pop up in cities like Tikrit, Fallujah, Ramadi, Najaf, and for years we had been hammering them back down into the ground. With success, we were definitely killing more of the enemy than they were of us, but we never had the ability to cover down on all those areas at once. So when the surge strategy was implemented, it allowed the Army to take 2 rifle companies from the Marine Corps and add them to their strength. And we were bigger in size than traditional Army companies. We were about 200, 250 Marines, where the Army at the time had about 80 soldiers to 100 soldiers because they'd suffered a lot of attrition and they'd been there for so long. So when we got into the city, it really allowed the Army to use us as a leverage to establish firm bases in the city, to gain and maintain security and a physical presence that they just hadn't been able to do. So as we went through and cleared entire sections of the city, the Army could come in and establish firm bases to which they could conduct future operations out of, establish local Iraqi police stations, Iraqi Army recruiting centers, and things that were designed to help future stability operations take root in that country.
Was that known as the clear and hold strategy? Was that the terminology used with the surge?
Clear and hold wasn't something that we doctrinally employed. We were conducting clearance operations. Our mission in Iraq in 2006 and 2007 was to kill or capture anti-Iraqi forces, and that's what we did. That was our whole mission.
When people hear cities like Fallujah, Ramadi, if you're not there and you don't have people in the service, the names kind of run together. What was unique about the challenges in Ramadi compared to what you knew was happening elsewhere?
Well, what's interesting about the city of Ramadi in itself, and it's interesting when general listeners or viewers hear the word like Ramadi. And when I wrote the book, and I was very insistent on that being the title, and there was a little bit of conversation. Well, no one's going to understand what Ramadi is. It's a strange word. It doesn't, and I kind of pitched it this way, because it was important for me to keep that title when I wrote Echo in Ramadi. Was people had never heard of Guadalcanal or places like Okinawa or Khe Sanh either until those books had been written and they'd become ingrained into our American culture. And that's why it's so important that people do learn that name. Our Ramadi, Iraq, it's the gray city. And Marines and soldiers died there. And they fought for not only the freedom of Iraq, but also to protect what we hold dear in this country. And it's one story that I absolutely didn't want it to be marginalized in the shadows of other great battles in Najaf or Baghdad or Fallujah that did get a lot of attention. And to this day, I still get emails and phone calls from a lot of the Marines, not even my Marines and soldiers that fought in Ramadi, thanking me for telling this story, because there's others written, but I don't think there's any written that are as detailed and as heartfelt with the emotion and the feeling that I was really lucky to get from my Marines and the families that told their stories that I shared in my writing in Echo in Ramadi.
We're going to take a quick break, Scott.
Okay.
We'll hold on right there. We'll be right back with Scott Huesing. The book is Echo in Ramadi. This is Veterans Chronicles. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Crumbie, honored to be joined in studio by Scott Huesing, retired U.S. Marine Corps infantry major and the author of Echo in Ramadi. And sir, in reading this book, it's clear that one of your priorities here is not just explaining what happened, but who you were with. You spend a lot of time explaining who these guys were that were critical in various parts of the story, and unfortunately in some cases the ones that you lost. It seems like that was a bigger feature than I've seen in a lot of other books. Explain why that was so important to you.
Well, I think, Greg, if you want to learn about events and things, you pick up a newspaper, right? And what's important to me is not the material things, but it's about people and why they do things. Why are you crossing your legs like that? How did it feel? When you squeezed the trigger on the rifle, what were you thinking? To get that type of emotion from so many different perspectives, I think is very unique. And I think that's what people want to read about. And when I describe my Marines in Echo and Ramadi, it's them. I did 75 interviews with all of my Marines, and I would have loved to have told 250 stories, but nobody wants to read a book that long. So the stories that I told were very important, and I think they're also very emblematic of what not only every Marine in Echo Company experienced, but what all soldiers and Marines did, not only in Iraq or Afghanistan, but in any war. Because it's a cliche maybe, or a simple adage that war is timeless, but it really is. And there's distinctions and comparisons you can make, but I often get asked the question, how were your Marines better? And how did you understand that they were trained so well to be so effective at what they did, to suffer so few casualties, even though we did lose Marines. We did have dozens of Marines wounded. I think talking to my Vietnam veterans and Korean War veterans is that there's an understanding of the Arab culture, of the regional culture that our military has today that we prepare them for. And because of the fact that they know about that culture, I think it really set them up for success on the battlefield, because they were living in the city. We lived in the city amongst the people, where 90% of them were good, peace-loving Iraqis. And there was probably another 10% that were insurgents, 5% hardcore fighters, and then 5% that maybe just wanted to make a name for themselves. And they stood up and tried to fight us in Ramadi, and they lost badly on most days. But the fact that the Marines understood the culture and were able to interact with the people, it really was valuable. And I like to say this too, is that in comparison to other battles, you could say perhaps that the Battle of Ramadi was significant in the fact that, one, it was the capital city of Al-Anbar province, and two, it can be compared to maybe the Tet Offensive of Vietnam. We won Ramadi. Make no mistake about it. The Marines and the Army that fought in Ramadi, we won that city. We set the conditions in 2004, and then we pulled back, and then they had to retake it again in 06 and 07, and we did. And that's validated not only from our actions in that small fraction of time we spent there, but the Army, who was there well before we showed up and stayed long after we left. But they made me realize that we had made a difference together, the Marines and the Army, as this joint team. And what happened afterwards, by giving that city back to Iraq, they punted it through the grandstands of life. And I think we only need to look at our history books in May of 2015 to understand when ISIS began to rear its ugly head, what city did they take? Ramadi, because of its key terrain, significant importance with the government. It was no mystery. And none of us needed a crystal ball back then, Greg, to realize if we didn't plant a flag in this country, proverbially speaking, build a physical presence like we did from our past battles, and learn from our history like we did in the Pacific Theater, as we did in the European theater after World War II. If we didn't do that, we knew we'd be back there. And today is February 22nd, 2018, and all the Marines and soldiers that are in Iraq, in Afghanistan fighting today, it's not portrayed in the mainstream media. They're not getting the credit they deserve, and they're there doing the same things we did, just on a different scale. And all Americans need to know about that. I think that's something that I'm proud to say, that I recognize the fact that they're still over there serving.
What was your reaction when, obviously, all the sacrifice you and your men and other Marines and other Army units put in to see what happened when ISIS came through there?
People ask me that question a lot. People ask my Marines that, and I don't think we sit around and pine about the blood we spilled or the Marines that gave every measure of devotion in their lives, I don't think that keeps us up at night, because we knew if we didn't stay there, it was going to fall again. It was just a matter of certainty. I think that what the Marines and the soldiers did in 2006 and 2007 in that city, they made a difference. And aside from killing a lot of the bad guys that needed to be killed, they also helped a lot of good people. And that's what Marines do. It's really the true spirit of what Marines do, is they help those that can't help themselves. And every time they're employed into combat or in a humanitarian role, that's what they do. And they always perform remarkably, and makes me extremely proud to have spent almost 25 years with that organization and be affiliated with them in every way. And I still am. And that's the beauty of this network, and the power of human connection, and the power of the military family, is that we still stay very connected.
Scott, we'll take another quick break here. Retired U.S. Marine Corps Infantry Major Scott Huesing. The book is Echo in Ramadi. We'll be right back on Veterans Chronicles. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Crumbie. Thanks for being with us. Our guest this week, retired U.S. Marine Corps Infantry Major Scott Huesing, veteran of Operations Desert Storm, Iraqi Freedom, and Enduring Freedom. And he's also the author of the new book, Echo in Ramadi, the first-hand story of U.S. Marines in Iraq's deadliest city. And Scott, I want to talk pretty much at length in this segment about the personal stories again, some of these guys that you talked about. And obviously it started before you got to Iraq. I think it might have been in the story you talked about Libby, your squad leader, who unfortunately lost his life, and how at training, I think you might have been at 29 Palms, and you're just strolling through at night. He's got a bottle of something and offered you a drink, and it's just that kind of commitment to getting to know your guys that certainly struck me, and I'm certainly that struck a lot of readers as well. Talk about that process, taking the time to do that, and how that cohesion played out when you were at war.
Well, I often get asked the question, because I was prior enlisted, if that made me a better officer. And my answer is always the same, Greg. No, it didn't make me a better officer. I think it absolutely gave me a different perspective of what the young Marines were going through, how valuable their time was, and how I never wanted to misuse that time. And I also understood that being genuine and really connecting with those who is your privilege to lead. It's not a right, it's your privilege, and quite an honor to be put in a position to do that, where you influence and impact so many lives. You never realize it at that time. And sometimes it takes 5 or 10 years and you get a phone call and they remind you of something you said. And that's a unique responsibility that you don't often think of. But developing relationships is really the most important thing about being a good leader. And that's not exclusive to me. I didn't invent any of that, but I've always been aware of that and tried to listen to the Marines. And although I'm sure there's times I could be accused of not being such a great listener, but circumstances dictate. But to be close to your Marines, to those you lead, is an important tenet of leadership. And it's not listed as a trait or principle of leadership, but compassion is on the top of my personal list, because you need to understand how things affect them and how they deal with things, how their personal lives matter, while still making the mission the number one priority. And if you do that, you're going to set yourself up for success as a leader. And there's a fine line. You don't want to be too familiar. I never say that I was good friends with my Marines. They've got enough friends. They've only got one commanding officer, and that's what I always made them realize. They got plenty of friends. But I was always approachable, and I always thought my place was with the Marines. And if there was gear to be moved, I was moving it. If there was a patrol, I was on it. If there was a firefight, I was in it. And I never wanted to task my Marines, order them to do things that I was not absolutely willing to do myself. And I know there's examples of people that do that. I wasn't one of them. But again, that's how I operated, and it's not just Scott Huesing. The majority of infantry officers, the majority of military officers, that's the tenet of leadership they subscribe to. Marines lead from the front in everything we do. We eat last, and we lead from the front. And it's just something so important to know the people you lead. And whether it's in corporate America or whether it's on the battlefield or in the military, it's a people business. You have to know your people to be successful. And that's one of the leadership lessons that comes through in Echo and Ramadi as well, is it's not just about the fighting, the friction, the families that support us. It's also about making tough decisions, being a leader and knowing when the mission comes first and when to be lenient in some cases. So those lessons of leadership and overcoming adversity and how to manage people and personalities at times, that comes through, and that's applicable not only to our future generation of warfighters, but in the boardroom and corporate offices across the world.
You opened the book talking about the death of Libby, your squad leader, and that obviously draws in the reader so intensely. You talk about having to talk to his mother and the impact it had on you personally. I'm guessing even as gripping as it is in the book, it's hard to put into words what that's like.
Yeah, Corporal Libby was one of our squad leaders, and he died on December 6th in a grueling 5-hour firefight. It was one of the most complex and coordinated attacks we'd seen to date, and we'd only been in the city for a few weeks, although we'd experienced a lot of heavy fighting. When we got the news that Corporal Libby had been killed, it really did stun us, and it was the first loss, the first death we had in the entire battalion. And it happened to us. So it was not just a shocking, but also sobering experience as we lost one of our key leaders. And Libby was another one of those gregarious personalities that I highlighted in the book. And there's just some people that stand out, and Libby was one of them. And there were many others. But to say that I knew all of my Marines at that type of level, as I described, it wouldn't be true. I mean, there's some guys that just kind of hide under the radar. Mm-hmm. They don't want to hang out with the CO. They don't want to divulge or get too close or give too much away. But Libby was not that way. He was very outgoing, and he was a leader. And he understood that when bullets are flying and bombs are exploding, rank, age, and gender, or any of that, none of it comes into play. And he understood that very well. And that's why I trusted him so implicitly. And it was such a huge hit to not only me, but the entire company when we lost Libby, because everyone loved him. And when I had to make the phone call to his mom, I don't think there's a requirement to do it. I think every officer or leader gets some trivial class on how to write a condolence letter. But as I write in the book too, there's no training that can prepare you for it to do that. It's tough. Yeah, it's tough. But I felt that I owed Jenny Libby a phone call that night. And through the midst of everything, the fighting and the friction that night, when I took Libby to the aid station in my Humvee and turned him over to our first sergeant, our senior enlisted, Tom Foster, I knew he was in good hands, but I didn't know the outcome. But we knew it was bad. Then we've ultimately found out the news. That's when I decided to call his mom and talk to her. And, despite the painful experience that it was for me to make that phone call and even to talk about it, even though I do because I think it's important, the brightness that comes through that story that I want people to understand is that in all of her pain that day, hearing me tell her that her son was dead, the first thing that she said to me was, "Thank you." And I couldn't believe it. It literally stunned me to hear those words, come from Jenny, who was in Castle Rock, Maine, and I'd never met her, but she was a mom, and she knew that what we were doing in Iraq was hard work. She knew Dustin loved being a Marine more than anything, and she knew it was a miserable place that we were fighting in. And to hear her thank me for calling is indescribable. I mean, our Gold Star families are just a group of extraordinary people. There's no other way to describe them. They're not ordinary people. I don't know how you lose a son or daughter and then are still able to carry the torch and shine light for all of us who are still fighting. And even though we lost a brother that day, they lost their son. And then I had to make that same phone call again to his brother and to his dad on that same night. And it was very tough. But it's something that, again, I don't think that receiving a letter in the mail is how I would want to find out about it. I owed it more than that, and it was important to me. I don't think most Americans can realize, and these are things that were peeled back when I started doing the interviews. At the time, I knew Ryan Downing, who was one of my young Marines, troublemaker. I knew it from the day I met him, but I loved him. And he was a thin, wiry, scrappy, kid who'd already seen more than his share of combat during the first Battle of Ramadi. And when he got injured for the second time in Iraq, and I had to call his mom that he'd been medevaced out of country, she picked up the phone and we talked, and it wasn't until a little bit into the conversation that I found out that not only was her son Ryan in Iraq, her son Justin was also in Iraq, and her husband Jeff was in Iraq, all at the same time. She had all three of her Marines, all three of her men fighting in Iraq at the same time. And again, just blown away when she told me, thank you for calling. None of my Marines commanders have ever taken the time to call me. And all three of them had gotten injured at one point or another. Justin was blown up in a convoy explosion and received his first Purple Heart at the age of 18 or 19. Ryan Downing, my Marine, was already on his second Purple Heart. And just the Blue Star families, and they're an amazing organization too, because it's not just the guys fighting that you see on TV that are deployed and get a little bit of coverage. That you multiply that times 4 or 5 on the people that they leave behind every time they deploy, and I think it's staggering. And my story's kind of out there for people to know through media and TV, and it was even on Fox News when I left my wife pregnant in our driveway in Virginia in 2004, 8 months pregnant, and said, good luck with that. And the first time I saw my daughter was on Fox News when she was born. And then I redeployed after a 10-month deployment and met my daughter for the first time, and she was 5 months old. But there's families that are left behind, and I think that's important, is that there's so many second and third order effects. And to be successful in the military is largely dependent on what we do. I mean, it was largely dependent on my wife, who supported me as independent as she was, for raising my daughter Bailey in my absence after so many deployments, and so many deployments that were extended. Normally it's 6 or 7 months, but for whatever reason I had this curse of being extended for 9, 10 months at a time, which was just based off the needs of the mission. So Kimberly Downing and her entire family, I want to say thank you to them again for not only sharing their story, but raising a great generation of warriors. I mean, these families that, I say it euphemistically, but that breed these young men and women to serve in our nation's military, they really are the finest people.
Just a few minutes left with Scott Huesing, author of Echo in Ramadi, and just do want to get back to a little bit of the tactical in Ramadi, given that it was so, it's urban warfare, and it's not typical warfare. It's asymmetric, I guess was the term often used. Was there a general strategy? Did it depend on the specific mission of the day? How did you go about, whether it's house to house or other different threats out there, about how you confronted them?
Well, again, fighting an asymmetric war where literally you're living amongst the people, you're living in the city, the front line is everywhere, the enemy wears no uniform, they blend in well with the locals. And at that time, we weren't fighting strategies or policy. We were fighting the enemy. And our mission was to kill or capture anti-Iraqi forces. And again, we were extremely effective. Our mission was pretty simple. And it was a little bit where the art meets science and vice versa, as we conducted clearance operations in the city. And through our technology, we're extremely effective. I mean, we had advanced weaponry, we had advanced optics, night vision devices, thermal optics. So we owned the night. So that's when we went out to hunt. And we pursued the enemy, constantly knocking them back on their heels as we moved through block after block, house after house, room after room, clearing every single thing out of that city. And I had a strict policy. And some of the Marines didn't like it, but it wasn't an option for them. Whenever they went into any structure, I made them take every single weapon out and carry it out. Now, that may seem like an easy task. picking up weapons and taking them out of houses for insurgents that are hiding them there as weapons caches. But now you're talking about an individual Marine who's already carrying about 45 to 60 pounds of gear, water, ammunition, his own rifle, and now he's picking up 2-3 extra rifles that weigh maybe 8 to 10 pounds each. He's throwing them on his back, and then to get caught in another firefight, it becomes a significant emotional event. Trust me, it's cumbersome, and that's where I describe it as this friction, this indescribable friction that can only be felt by those that have been subjected to that type of pressure under those circumstances. So we did this day in and day out, clearing inch by inch of the city and leaving nothing untouched. And around every corner was a squad of Marines, and if the insurgents wanted to come out and fight that day, it wound up being a bad day for them. We wound up pushing west, working for another task force, and I tell this story in the book because I think it's kind of funny, but we checked in, and it was an armored task force. They asked me how I was going to move around the city, how many vehicles I want. I said, none. They said, well, how many Bradleys do you want? I said, none. How many APCs? None. He said, well, how are you going to get around the city, Scott? I said, we're going to walk. I said, we're going to walk through every single street, every single house. And again, if there's an insurgent that wants to pop his head out around the corner, he's going to run into one of my squad of Marines, and it's going to be a bad day. Because we crawled through that city like cockroaches when the lights were turned on, and my Marines were engaging and killing the enemy every single day. And the way they did it was not only with lethality, because they're the most deadly weapons on the battlefield as individual Marines, and how straight they shoot their rifles, but they do it under such an immense pressure, but they do it with honor as well. And I was always impressed with the way they conducted themselves on the battlefield. And that was part of their training going in too. And I made that abundantly clear as before we were thrust into the city of Ramadi, is I told them that that's what they're going to have to do. You will have to kill. And I always wanted them to know that it was coming from me, so they could do that and never hesitate when it came down to making that one conscious decision, that singular movement of squeezing the trigger on that rifle and taking another human life, which is a horrific and life-changing event for an 18-year-old kid. I wanted him to know that I was ordering them to kill, because that's what Marines do. They follow orders. And at the end of this war, at the end of the battles, I wanted them to leave that place with a clean heart. And to get them to understand that, I think, was important. And it was, again, validated by those 50 combat vets that had been in the first battle of mine. My salty, seasoned vets of now 22 years old. That's how seasoned they were. But regardless, they performed phenomenally each and every time.
And I think that's another thing that you do a great job of getting across in this book. In fact, I think you say it right there in the beginning of the prologue, is that if your idea of combat is Hollywood or is somehow glamorous, let me disabuse you of that right now. And then, of course, as you go throughout the book, it becomes abundantly obvious. But given the fact that it's a small percentage of families that are now connected to the military on active duty, how important is it for the rest of us to understand that it's not what Hollywood or anybody else would have us believe, but it's actually what you describe it to be?
I think it's important for listeners and anyone to understand, especially those in communities that aren't close to a military base, that aren't close to military organizations, middle America, that are kind of removed from it other than what they see on TV. And I did try to describe it in such granularity and detail so that it really paints a picture for the reader in Echo and Ramadi of what it's like, not only the surroundings, but what the people look like and what they felt. And I think it's important so they really understand the sacrifice that these young warriors made and the sacrifices of the families and the loss of our Gold Star families, because they didn't take an oath. They didn't get a vote. We did. And the fact that they lost a son or daughter throughout this long war, that's something they have to live with their entire lives. We can live with what we lost and what we sacrificed because we chose that. We made that decision. So I think that's important, and I think that readers will get a different inside look, because that's why this just isn't another war story. It's about the people. and it's about the feeling and this emotion that comes through. It's not about one sniper or a team of Navy SEALs. It's about 250 Marines and soldiers and sailors and their families and friends and interpreters and all of these great, citizen warriors that stepped up to help us fight, win, and survive in what was the deadly city of Iraq in 2006. It's just really something different. And again, Greg, it's my honor to be able to share the story with you and be able to write it and share it with everybody.
Last question. I know you've also started an organization to help veterans or perhaps even active duty struggling to cope with some of what they've been through now that they're home. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm also the executive director of SaveTheBrave.org. It's a nonprofit, certified nonprofit that was actually started by one of my young Marines, one of my young warfighters in Echo Company, who just wanted a way to help veterans connect. And he asked me to come on board and help grow the organization several years ago, and we've been doing great things, helping hundreds of vets, because we think that there's no better medicine, no vaccine or pill that the VA or doctors can give that's really any better than connecting veterans so they can share their stories. Because military personnel only make up less than 1/2 of the American population. Of over 330 million people in this country, less than 1/2. Within that, there's the Marine Corps. Within that, there's the infantry. Within the infantry, there's those guys like my Marines in Echo Company who were in combat. And those that were in combat squeezed the trigger on the rifle, had to make those life and death decisions. So when they start to unpack those traumatic events, those life-changing events, there's a very limited audience with which they can share. So I think it's important to have another organization in place where we can provide them a safe environment to share their stories, know they're always protected. And if they do need more help, we have a great network of resource providers that we vector those young guys to. And it's not just Marines, it's any veteran. And we screen them all through the veteran centers to make sure we're getting the right people to the right programs who need help. And I think that's important. And a portion of the proceeds of Echo and Ramadi will be donated to SaveTheBrave.org because I'm committed to it. And I wouldn't have it on the inside of the cover of the book if I wasn't. And I think if you give first, good things follow. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book as well. It's just helping vets. It just makes me feel good at the beginning and end of every day.
I really hope you enjoyed watching this video. Please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into our history. Together, we remember. Together, we learn.